From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on Middle East affairs and U.S. policy produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Fadi Nassar, U.S. Lebanon Fellow at MEI and Director of the Institute for Social Justice and Conflict Resolution, and Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at the Lebanese American University. Today I'll be talking with Ronnie Chatah, host of the Beirut Banyan, founder of WalkBeirut and prolific columnist. In its fourth year with over 300 episodes, the Beirut Banyan covers all that is modern Lebanese history, never steering away from the most timely and decisive issues. Today, Ronnie and I will talk about the recent arrest of the families of the victims of the Port of Beirut Blast and the consequent implications on justice and Lebanon's crisis. In many ways, the blast is a microcosm of Lebanon's compounded crises. I'm hoping today's podcast can also help identify opportunities for action from the multiple local and international stakeholders. Good evening, Ronnie, and thank you for joining us.
Good evening to you, and it's an honor to be a guest on another podcast. Since I podcast now for a living, it's always a treat to be on the other end.
We'll try and do you justice. I thought we could start off this talk with an introduction for some of our listeners who are not too familiar with the unraveling situation in Lebanon over the investigation, the Port of Beirut Blast, particularly the developments surrounding the judge Tariq Bitar and the families of the victims of the blast.
If I were to take a step back, in my best assessment, I think what we're seeing is a small but important attempt at resurrecting what should be standard course in Lebanese judicial affairs. You're looking at years and years of political paralysis. You're looking at decades of security impasses. And at the same time, you're seeing, in my assessment, a courageous judge, Tariq Bitar, investigative judge, who's been paralyzed from doing his job for the better part of the last 15 months, showing up to work, surprisingly, just 2 days ago, and trying to send a message, which is he's willing to stick it out, no matter what the cost. And that type of act, even if it is only symbolic in the end, meaning even if it doesn't produce a proper investigation, or even if it doesn't offer a verdict down the road into a massive port blast that happened 2.5 years ago, the symbolic gesture in itself is critical. And it's, to me at least, it reminds me of smaller attempts in the past, in the recent past, primarily ones in 2008, where you had Lebanese state officials trying to do their job. And back in 2008, this was mostly telecoms communications that were deemed illegal, mainly operated by Hezbollah, that were tried at least, attempts to shut those down. A security official at the airport close to Hezbollah attempted at firing him. Those decisions taken, even though they were reversed, obviously, led to battles on the streets of Beirut and changed our politics. It changed it to a status quo that we're still living in, which is Hezbollah's security dominion. And at the same time, there is a judge, Tariq Bitar, signaling to a very, very tired, very increasingly hopeless Lebanese population, which is he's still trying to do his job. And in my mind, I think that is a brave act, and he'll be remembered fondly for this.
There are two elements here, but something that I find so important that you're speaking to is often one quips that institutions in Lebanon and those who occupy them are sort of void of the leadership, right? Or for better yet, civil servants, those who believe in what they are doing. One just passes them as failed institutions, and that those who occupy them are just cronies. And I'm not trying to take away, right, from the capture of institutions. And certainly when we look at the judiciary, and we'll get to that a bit later, there are problems. But Tariq Bitar, important as he is, in many ways, some of the arguments are there are many people like him that exist and that push back despite that despair. Just something that that I found compelling in what you were saying. And it's always important to really look at those nuances. But with that, because in your podcast you have done, you've really drawn attention to the Port of Beirut blast and its aftermath. And you've spoken to such a wide range of, whether it's the families of the victims, whether it's different, MPs, voices for accountability. Are there any notable guests and their perspectives that perhaps you could highlight for us?
Well, I'll say two things actually. If you don't mind, I'll kind of add to what you said earlier, and I fully agree that there are many courageous Lebanese civil servants, protesters, or for that matter, even daring MPs at times, cabinet ministers. I mean, Lebanon is full of heroes. And yesterday was the 15th anniversary of the assassination of Wissam Eid, who was an intelligence officer who helped actually provide data for the Special Tribunal for Lebanon that was looking primarily into Rafiq Hariri's assassination, the former prime minister, 2005. 15 years since his assassination, he was a young, very brave, very competent intelligence officer doing his job. And the special tribunal depended on that data collection for its own investigation. So I fully share that sentiment. And Tarek Bitar is one of those kinds of men in Lebanese politics, men and women, that has been doing his job to the fullest extent possible, even at a big cost. But going back to more recent guests, I can think of one automatically, William Noon. William Noon, if I'm not mistaken, I recorded it just several days ago, maybe mid last week. He was released from detention, arrested over the weekend for protesting at the Justice Palace, which is where the protests happened today. He was detained, released, and he gave me his time. I actually went to visit him in the north, away from Beirut, and I think he reminded me that it doesn't matter how bleak things are, there's still an appetite and a demand, if you will, to nudge things forward, even when those are marginal movements ahead. They're important. And what William Noon did, I think, is really he showed, I think, where the mood is right now, which is it's about doing whatever you can, knowing that things have fully collapsed, and that could mean getting arrested, but it doesn't matter. You're still going to try to break into the Justice Palace. You're still going to try to vent your rage. And William Noon's brother, Joe Noon, a firefighter, was killed by the port blast. And it's not 2.5 years have gone by, and time is not on anyone's side. I think he has a way of delivering that street charisma, but also a bit of eloquence as well when he talks about politics. And I'm going to emphasize something. I don't usually meet protesters who have just come out of detention able to pontificate and reflect a lot. He did it, and he stunned me, actually. There was a sense of maturity in his understanding of Lebanese politics and paralysis, which I was a bit taken aback by. And I told him this, actually. I said in the episode that it's one thing to protest and it's another thing to try to analyze what's happening. He's done both astutely. So he's one of my favorite guests. And it's not just him. I mean, I've spoken to Paul and Tracy Najjar, a famous couple that lost their daughter, Alexandra Najjar. It was her birthday, I believe, yesterday. Or if not, sorry, it's today, actually. That was a very emotional journey into loss due to political violence. I think the podcast format, it gives these kinds of voices the adequate time needed to really go down a road that maybe they can't on news segments or on television bulletins or even sort of fast-paced media. They find a way to emotionally explain what they're going through as well. So it's always an honor to speak to them.
I find myself a bit moved, and it certainly brings to light. I think that you use the word heroes, and when I think of the first responders, the firefighters who put their lives, to serve, to do right, to do justice, it certainly speaks, as we said, to heroes not just from the perspective of top leadership or those who challenge power, but really across the country. And it's just something to always keep in mind when we're having these sort of political discussions. And the sort of underlying element is what's why I was so moved is you tell stories. Your podcast tells stories. And these are stories of truth that speak to the pain, to the injustice, to the, I would say, resistance to that, to the not just hope, but a hope that is fought of many of these survivors. So I want to perhaps ask you, what does the blast itself mean to you? And what does justice or accountability for it look like?
Wow, that's a big two-parted question. Let me try to pick at it as best as possible. Let me start by trying to digest the port blast into a proper answer. To me, this is the consequence of Lebanon being a battlefield for regional war for far too long. And when I say that, I'm not talking about recent years. I'm going back in time. Since Lebanon was sucked into regional wars that it had no control over from the 1970s onwards, I think the port blast is the most unfortunate reminder that even after the civil war ended in 1990, even after the Syrian regime left Lebanon in 2005, after the Israelis left in 2000, even after massive protest movements trying to change this country for the better in March 14, 2005, and October 17, 2019, even after Lebanon was paying such a severe price for housing weapons grade ammonium nitrate in its port, in Beirut's port. And to an audience that doesn't know Beirut, the port is in the city. This is not an adjacent port. It's the heart of Beirut. To make it personal, even though it's not necessary, my own apartment was destroyed by the port blast, and many people died, hundreds of deaths, thousands of injured, and families that are still suffering. And some of them even get arrested for venting their rage. Port blast to me is the most telling example of a country that lost agency, lost its sovereignty, and the collateral damage, whether that's severe corruption or negligence or insecurity in sensitive sites, perhaps bent to Hezbollah's will at times, perhaps at other times, simple recklessness that Lebanon and Beirut in particular blew up. It's the second largest non-nuclear blast. I'm sorry, it's the largest non-nuclear blast in modern history. And that maybe offers a segue to the second question. Justice to me begins with an impartial investigation. It doesn't end there. So justice to me starts with an investigation that is allowed to do its job without intimidation. And unfortunately, the reality of Lebanon is that even when someone like Tariq Bitar tries, he's prevented from doing his job. He's been prevented for over 15 months, but I'll answer it better. I sense that the only form of justice that resonates in modern Lebanese history is the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. Not because it's a main achievement in anything other than an investigation led to a verdict and guilty individuals were accused. They're free, maybe some are dead. But that is the first step, the first stage of justice. It's accountability. And I think Lebanon is being denied that. And at the moment, these are just hours ago. I think we're seeing it end. I think we're seeing the end of that kind of ambition.
How would you say the Special Tribunal for Lebanon fits into conceptualizing accountability for the Port of Beirut blast?
I think the stories are the same, meaning political violence brings the port blast and political assassinations together. Lebanon is a battlefield for regional war. Its most obvious example of that predicament is Hezbollah's leverage in this country. And Hezbollah is not a Lebanese militia only. It is Iran's preferred proxy army in the region. And that in itself poses a problem, meaning security issues in this country, for the most part, are dictated by that group. When that group feels threatened, it fights back. The Special Tribunal for Lebanon was largely meant to prevent further political assassinations. Truth is, at the end, even though the verdict was issued, in those 15 years that went by, from 2005 to 2020, a dozen Lebanese paid the price. And that group stands accused for the successful and attempted assassinations from 2004 to 2005. And the port blast, the investigation that started and actually gained some traction, was led by Tarek Bitar until October 2021. And October 21, you had fighting on the streets of Beirut in Tayouni roundabout. Lebanese were protesting Tarek Bitar's mission, largely Hezbollah-backed protest that degenerated into street violence. That was just hours after a Hezbollah security official, Wafi Safa, threatened Tarek Bitar with his work. This group is able to determine the contours of justice in this country, and it is also able to get away with many things, including the Lebanese state's reluctance to arrest individuals accused by the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. I think the story is the same. It's one of political violence, and it's one of impunity.
Let me start perhaps with this question. I know you've engaged in some critical debates surrounding the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, and it's one of the most misunderstood international tribunals and very misunderstood in Lebanon. And one of perhaps the most common critiques that you've recently engaged with is it worth it? Was it worth it? I thought I'd give you this moment to respond to that criticism.
You know, it's funny that you mentioned this. Every few seconds now on Twitter, I get either tagged or I'm part of some social media back and forth on the merits of the tribunal. So this happens almost instantaneously now. I share your description of the tribunal. I think for the most part, it's misunderstood. And I think people expected far more from it. And maybe it has to do with the scope of the tribunal and how long it took, and an emotional disappointment, meaning that the accused are not in jail. The verdict is one thing, but actually imprisoning the criminals deemed guilty is something else, and that did not happen. But if I could make my best case for the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, and I actually had this debate with a parliamentarian who's sleeping in parliament at the moment, Milham Khalaf, who doesn't share the sentiment. He believes in a local investigation only. I think the first step for accountability in this country is knowing exactly what happens when crimes are committed. And having the truth in front of you is a critical step. And if we're not able to investigate properly in this country due to threat, due to violence, due to intimidation, due to anything that would warp that investigation, it has to be done through international action. And that is why the Lebanese state in 2005 requested what became known as the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. Without that type of action, that crime scene on the Corniche of Beirut that tore apart the St. George Hotel's facade, that left a 10-meter crater in the pavement, would have been paved over, the facade would have been restored days after that blast. Instead, a thorough, meticulous forensic examination, investigation, led by Detlev Melis, a German investigator, in 2005, provided the foundation for what became the verdict 15 years later. The disappointment with the tribunal, I think, comes from that everyone who saw the assassinations continue after Rafiq Hariri's in February 2005 saw that the goal maybe was not being delivered. In other words, this was just an endless investigation, but crimes were continuing, political crimes. I think that's where the disappointment begins. And of course, at the end of the day, 15 years goes by in Lebanon, and so many bad things have happened. It's not just one assassination in 2005. And it's not the only form of violence in Lebanon. People, I think, grew weary of the process.
So, from what I'm hearing from you, the real sort of merit that comes from internationally supported tribunals or investigations is at least they get to the truth.
It gets you to the first step. That's the step proactively denied in Lebanon.
I'm very curious. I don't want to get into the details if it was a private debate, but perhaps could you tell us about the debates you've been having over a local versus an international investigation and why, again, you support the latter?
You know what? Actually, thankfully, that debate with at least the parliamentarian was turned into a podcast episode. So it's easy to listen. It's on the Beirut Banyan. You can hear, in a way, the back and forth, which I think is an important back and forth. But I'll give you a more recent example. This happened today with a journalist, a well-known journalist in Lebanon. The disappointment, I think, is that there's a betrayal to the injured and to the victims in general, that you don't see the criminals behind bars through an international process. I think that means a lot. In other words, over $1 billion, whatever the cost is on the Lebanese side, does not get criminals in jail. I think that is a one important argument made for why international action does not really give an emotional reward to those that suffer. And I think on the other side as well, it's that, at least with Lebanon and the special tribunal, it felt like it was being intentionally slowed down, not at its inception, but in the years thereafter. Whether it's in replacing Detlev Melis with Sergio Bremertz, if I'm not mistaken, and that things kind of seemed like they were stalling. And it was Lebanese that helped the special tribunal deliver information. And I referred to Wissam Eid earlier, that these are Lebanese officers. This is not an international team doing their work. These are Lebanese doing their work. Maybe they have a point in that it just took too long. And for whatever reason, could be a political decision, doesn't matter, that 15 years, a generation begins to forget and begins to move on. So that is worth talking about and debating. I don't think we should have an answer into the port blast in 2035. I think that would be a horrible scenario. So that's something I think the other side maybe has a point. But at the end of the day, the alternative would be no investigation. If you're going to keep things local, you're going to end up with what happened today: paralysis.
Do you have confidence in the local investigation? I know you have, as you said, immense respect for the judge Bitar, but do you have confidence in his investigation?
If he was investigating a crime in Denmark, then I would have no problem with what he's doing and the work he's conducting, and I would have full support for his mission. When he's doing his investigation in Lebanon, and he's not able to do his work for 15 months, and the day he returns, Lebanon's political scene goes haywire with not just the protests that happen outside the Justice Palace, but you have MPs getting beaten up for defending Tariq Bitar. You have a counter judge, Ghassan Ouaidet, suing Bitar. You have a travel ban. You have a standstill. You have low-level anarchy and violence. That's just 24 hours back doing his job. And add to that, Hezbollah's allies escalating their rhetoric against him, calling on his imprisonment. That only adds fuel to the fire. And I sense Tariq Bitar, had he been able to do his job, maybe he would be approaching his verdict. He said something today which I thought was quite interesting. He said that he will stay in his job no matter what. I don't know what that means. It could be perpetual paralysis. He could stay indefinitely. But I don't have faith. I don't have faith in an institution that has been eroded from within. I think he's a fantastic human being and he's a capable judge and a system that allows him to do his work. That's not the system he's in.
Is there a role for international actors, not just international organizations or tribunals, to play in all of this?
Oh, absolutely. If I could share my own experiences and frustrations when it comes to messaging this issue, what disappoints me repeatedly is the whether this is coming from well-intentioned diplomats in Lebanon or perhaps policymakers that still have some hope in the local process. The emphasis for Lebanese to do their job and to act despite everything that's happening, to stand tall and believe in the process and reform the state, all of that, this wishful thinking is simply impossible so long as if you have paramilitary force like Hezbollah in Lebanon. You have to accept a failed state as long as this problem is shelved. And if there's any rule in trying to make this current country governable again, it is to proactively find ways for Iran to disengage its security needs from this country. That is a requirement. It's not an afterthought. And the endless talk of sectarianism and sectarianism being an issue when it comes to Lebanese politics. The discussion about corruption and focusing in on economics only, or for that matter, trying to mitigate the crisis but not resolve the profound problem underneath. I think you're looking at a country that just erodes, and eventually just dies on everyone's watch. And I cannot see any other way other than proactive diplomacy with a country that refuses to let go of Lebanon.
So from what I've understood, for you, you've understood, the collapse of Lebanon to be the consequence of a state battered into failure, coerced into failure. And central to that, right, if we call it a deliberate depression, is that for you, that its deliberate collapse is rooted in Iran's sort of hegemonic intervention in Lebanon. Did I understand that argument correctly?
That it's the most recent version of that longer problem. In the old days, it was Syria's role in this country. Prior to that, the Arab-Israeli war was being fought in Lebanon. But the whole point of 2005, where I think at least a lot of the American audience that knows a bit more about Lebanon maybe than other countries, I think that's when they started tuning in. That in March 2005, a quarter of the population woke up from a post war slumber under Syrian hegemony and said, enough. They demanded reform, they demanded justice, they demanded independence. That's 18 years ago. None of those demands were fulfilled. And I don't blame Lebanese for not being able to fulfill them. I think any country that is faced with that kind of transition from Assad rule to Hezbollah dominion, any society would crash. I think, though, if I may interject a bit more, I think what makes this round a little different than 2005 is that in 2005, you had a Lebanese political establishment ready to go down that road. Coalition building, a majority alliance. I had the privilege of being able to write an article for the Middle East Institute about that issue. That there was a time where majority Lebanese government demanded things like an international investigation into the Rafiq Hariri assassination. That's not there right now. We don't have a majority alliance in parliament wanting that. And I think that's an unfortunate byproduct of 2 decades of this mess, that Lebanese MPs are unwilling to go down that road again, for many reasons, including the direct threat of violence. But that is not because Lebanese are bad. That's not because Lebanese are unable to get over their confessional differences. I think that kind of framework and trying to endlessly reform when you have a security problem, I think that to me is the type of crisis management stuff that it doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't work.
Then, in this context that you're describing, let me ask, are there any concrete policies that you propose that the US can take today?
I will answer it hopefully in a way that resonates with a DC based audience, let's say. Had things been different, no Lebanese should ask anyone abroad to do anything in this country. That there should be no request for anything. Lebanese should be allowed to reform their state, find a way to make it work better. And if sectarianism is part of the inefficiency, reform sectarianism as well. There's templates to do this. Lebanese have contrived them. We've learned from what a Senate looks like in the US. A sectarian Senate would make sense in this country. And by the way, it's part of Lebanon's constitution, or at least its roadmap, the Ta'if Agreement, that ended the Lebanese civil war. That's for Lebanese to determine. And for Lebanon to have diplomacy on its own terms, it should be allowed to talk to Iran directly. We don't need to go through Hezbollah to speak to Iran, or for that matter, Iran's messenger, not just in Lebanon, but the region, is its army based in Lebanon, Hezbollah. Then none of that makes sense. Diplomacy with Iran, I think, is key. Trying to get Iran to reconsider what it needs from this country. And it's not something it built yesterday. This is over 4 decades of building a machine that has actually now witnessed the collapse of the machine it inherited. And it's still there. And it's trying to survive too. I think engagement with Iran in any way possible and putting Lebanon on the table is necessary. If that doesn't happen, if Lebanon is deemed inconsequential, you're going to see a situation where other security interests take hold. And you will see opposition to Iran in Lebanon coming from actors I don't think the US necessarily wants to see gaining a foothold. And that could be an Assad return to this country via his allies. And that could actually be happening at the moment. And that's not the kind of politics I think Lebanese can wither. I think you'll see the end of what was once a cosmopolitan power sharing arrangement that withered through the French mandate, found its way post independence, but really began to die in 1970, and today is barely breathing. Getting any country out of Lebanon is a priority, but Iran today is really the problem. And if Iran leaves and Lebanese have the tools necessary to prevent any other country from ever doing what Iran did or what the Syrians did before, or how Fatah found its way into Lebanese politics, I think then we'd have a chance, perhaps, at reform. But until that issue is addressed, you're looking at the end of Lebanon.
I find myself not fully understanding one aspect. So you're telling us that there's been this, a vacuum, an authoritarian vacuum from the Assad regime that was sort of filled when they withdrew by Hezbollah, and more, from what I understood, you argue that acts as a proxy to Iran's own sort of security interests in Lebanon. At the same time, right, from what I'm getting, you're saying the only way to counter such a disproportionate power dynamic is by a larger power engaging with Iran, and that power being most likely the United States. Did I get that part of your argument correctly?
It's any country with Lebanon's interests at heart. And if they're able to engage Iran, I think one naturally goes to the Americans in their desperate desire for a wider deal with Iran. I think Lebanon needs to be put on the table.
So what I found interesting in the article you mentioned you wrote for MEI is that the United States, alongside France, right, was a critical actor in responding to the assassination of Rafiq Hariri and really working alongside with the United Nations, right, to see the withdrawal of Syrian forces from Lebanon. The question is, why did Lebanon matter then? And does it matter perhaps today for those countries that you mentioned? You keep saying they should have Lebanon's interests in mind. Why should they?
That's a fair question. That's actually that is a fair reading as well of the general disinterest in Lebanon's sovereignty. One could go back further. In the late 1980s, most players, including the Americans, were content with Syria's real violent takeover of whatever pockets remained in this country that were opposing its dominion in Lebanese affairs. And for the most part, you're right, there was 15 years of acceptance of Syrian occupation over Lebanon. So I think that's fair. I don't know. I can't ask another country to do Lebanon's bidding. But what I can hope for is that more Lebanese players, like those before them, that spoke the language of independence and agency and real sovereignty, that the crowd today that represents change in Lebanon and the crowd that once represented March 14 in this country, the March 14 movement, if they're able to eloquently communicate that their ambitions are curtailed for this reason, and if the Americans and the French and whoever, if they see an interest in diminishing Iran's leverage and security leverage in Lebanon as a way to stabilize this country once and for all, and to get it out of everyone's headaches and no longer be a money drain for any country that's trying to keep this country from fully collapsing. And if there's a chance to do that, I think it should be taken. But Lebanese need to demand it as well. And I agree with you that perhaps no country is ready to do this right now. But sorry, I'll also add one thing. I don't blame other countries for their disinterest. The Lebanese state has to request an international investigation into the port blast. It's not up to other countries to determine Lebanese affairs.
We're also at a global time, especially what we're hearing from this US administration, where democracy matters. And it is often in these small states and fragile states where the fight for democracy, where people like Tariq Bitar, people like the hundreds and thousands of protesters who protested for, despite political violence, despite intimidation, despite a debilitating crisis, after the Port of Beirut blast, protested, continued to fight. I mean, they have exhausted almost every sort of way of political participation for change, founded new political parties, competed in elections, and had, remarkable victories. I think these democracies matter. And in this fight that we are seeing between democracies and autocracies, these are the battlegrounds of the future. At least that's how I view it. But you mentioned you're not hopeful, so I hope to try and convince you to end it on a different note. With the final question, we're both talking from Beirut. I want to end this podcast with a question I find myself always struggling with. Why are you here?
Sure. I knew you were going to ask that. I felt it coming already, so I kind of I thought of it for a few seconds before it came out. I've seen too many good people meet an untimely, unjust end for loving this country a little too much. And if I can find a moment that my political, perhaps, inclinations began in Lebanon, it's reading a story about Beirut, a neighborhood called Sessin. To those that don't know, this is just an intersection in the neighborhood of Ashrafiyeh that used to have many cafes alongside it. In June 2005, reading a story, actually reading a book about Beirut's history, and meters away, a car bombing, a targeted killing, an assassination of Samir Asir, who was a Lebanese writer, journalist, a politician, and an academic, professor, and a complicated individual who resonated with me, meaning a leftist who stood up for Lebanon's sovereignty, a French speaking French citizen who had Palestinian and Syrian parents with a Lebanese passport, and who found himself comfortable across the political spectrum in this country, and a very humble human being that's killed in broad daylight. And I think that kind of person, if you're going to honor him and many more like him, it's not just him, but if you're going to do it, the only way to do it is to be in this country, communicating that message as eloquently as possible, day in, day out, and standing up for what they believed in. My reading of Samir Asir, my reading of many like him, and this includes my own father, who was assassinated in late 2013, the Lebanon that they dreamed of, I think, is the Lebanon of their childhood. And that's the 1950s and 1960s. And it's a more tolerant, a probably far lazier environment, meaning the political violence was at a much lesser scale than it is today. And if it was governable, and it was perhaps a bit inefficient and outdated, but it worked. It worked enough. And they grew up in a Lebanon, I think, that maybe no longer exists. Maybe it exists in the minds of most Lebanese. But that in itself is a mission. It's persuading an audience that is desperate to end this nightmare to remember that there is a country that once existed, wasn't so bad, and these are the people that paid the ultimate price for defending that country. Once you leave Lebanon and you try to do that, I think the persuasion fails. And I think the narrative doesn't work. You have to be here, you have to live through this very difficult chapter and understand the suffering intimately to express that desire effectively. And that's probably, at the end of the day, that's why I stick around. That's why I used to give my walking tours. It was a tribute to Samir Asir. It's why I podcast. And just to answer it in the most roundabout way, going back to the beginning of this conversation, Lebanon doesn't have justice. There's no justice in this country. There's no fairness either. But storytelling, if you do it right, you offer a poetic version of justice that I think resonates. And that's really what I do. At the age of 41, I'm in a country that has failed, largely collapsed. Technically in my prime, I'm trying to capture that as best as possible. And whether I succeed or not, I don't know, but that's really why I'm here.
And thank you for being here, Ronnie, with us and in Lebanon.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.